we too are meant to share in the power of resurrection in our lives. Sometimes this will look like sharing what we have experienced. Other times it might be pointing to what others have experienced in their own lives. But this kind of witness is about what we share with our words. Some of you know the writer Lamott, who had a very unexpected and surprising journey to the Christian faith. She was addicted to drugs and alcohol at some very dark times decades ago, was running from various problems. And while her life was still a mess, she wandered into a little church where she lived, and it kind of surprised her and horrified her that she was actually going to a church. But for some reason, she stuck around in this church for a long set of weeks. And things were bleak in her life. And one night, after a particularly bad day, she was drunk again for the umpteenth time. She found herself in bed, and things were very dark in her life. And in her memoir, she writes how the risen Christ showed up. One night, she was in her room, she was about to go to bed, and this is what she says. I had a cigarette and turned off the light in bed. After a while, as I lay there, I became aware of someone with me, hunkered down in the corner. The feeling was so strong that I actually turned on the light for a moment to make sure no one was there. Of course, there wasn't. But after a while, in the dark again, I knew beyond any doubt that it was Jesus. And I was appalled. I thought about my life and my brilliant, hilarious, progressive friends. I thought about what everyone would think of me if I became Christian, and it seemed an utterly impossible thing that simply could not be allowed to happen. I turned to the wall and said out loud, I would rather die, she writes. I felt him just sitting there on his haunches in the corner of my sleeping loft, watching me with patience and love. And I squinched my eyes shut, but that didn't help because that's not what I was seeing him with. Finally, I fell asleep, and in the morning, he was gone. This experience shook me badly, but I thought it was just an apparition, born of fear and self-loathing and booze and loss of blood. And then everywhere I went, after this, however, I had the feeling that a little cat was following me, wanting me to reach down and pick it up, wanting me to open the door and let it in. But I knew what would happen. You let a cat in one time, give it a little milk, and then it stays forever. And then she says this, and 1 week later, when I went back to church, I was so hungover that I couldn't stand up for the songs. And this time I stayed for the sermon, which I just thought was so ridiculous, like someone trying to convince me of the existence of extraterrestrials. But the last song was so deep and raw and pure that I could not escape. I began to cry and left before the benediction, and I raced home and felt that little cat running along my heels, and I walked down the dock past the potted flowers under a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams, and I opened the door to my houseboat, and I stood there a moment, and I hung my head, and I said, forget it, I quit. She actually uses a different word than forget right there. I quit. I took a long, deep breath and said out loud, all right, you can come in. So this was my beautiful moment of conversion, she writes. That was from her book, Traveling Mercies, that I first read a couple of decades ago, and it was the first time that I heard a Christian testimony that wasn't just kind of nicely tied up in a bow, kind of Christian-y or churchy, but it was real and raw and honest. And her story, her testimony is not about Jesus walked into my life and immediately fixed all of my problems and everything's just been bliss ever since then. No, it was more like Jesus was just right there with me, and we walked together very slowly to the next thing that needed to happen, to the next thing, and to the next thing. It was a 10-year journey of sobriety, but she was able to write about it later. In other words, that is her witness. And that's a witness that we can even point to. So that's what I mean by the witness of our words.